purpose of this presentation is just to give an overview, sort of high level, of the HUD CoC system performance measures. And while giving a high level overview, I also wanted to call out things that I think are sort of like low hanging fruit on the data front, that can be sort of things that are worked on by the committee or sort of under this committee's umbrella or separately. So I did want to make space for sharing that as well. And so I'll talk through some of those things too. All right, so before we get started, I did want to point out that the HUD Exchange has a lot of resources on the system performance measures. And we'll share this presentation with the group, and so you can access the links. But here are just a few of the ones that I pulled out. There's stuff that's super specific, like the programming specifications. There's stuff that's more high level. They do have some videos where they talk about how the different system performance measures are calculated. So there is good stuff on the HUD Exchange available to people who want to learn more. So when we talk about the system performance measures, there are 7 of them. And they are length of time homeless, returns to homelessness, number of homeless persons, jobs and income growth, first time homeless, stabilizing people in homeless category 3, and successful placement and retention of housing. So those are the 7 system performance measures. We're going to work our way through all 7 of them, touching briefly on them. But before we get started on that, I did want to just point out some sort of general info about the SPMs. The biggest one being that the SPMs are reported out on the person level, as this is different than, say, the LSAs, which are focused on the household level. So I think that's important when we think about some things, particularly for family providers. A household, every person in a household is pretty much contributing equally to each of the system performance measures, with the exception of measure 4, which is only for adults, because that's income. So if we think about measure 7, which is exits to permanent housing destinations, right? A household, a family of 5, with a negative exit will actually be counted. Each of those 5 people will be counted as having a negative exit. So it's just something to think about and consider. And then I just have a couple more notes. There is kind of like this date by which HUD says the data before 10/1/2012 is probably not so good. We're not going to pull anything prior to that. There are some exceptions to that, however, but by and large, the sort of clock started ticking, as it were, in HMIS on 10/1/2012. And the SPMs are submitted to HUD each year by the CoC, and encompassing the data across the CoC, and it covers the federal fiscal year. So that's 10/1 to 9/30. In terms of the project types that are covered under the SPMs, it's not everything. And the most notable exceptions are coordinated entry data and homelessness prevention data as well. It's not included, but the biggest one probably that you all spend so much time on, coordinated entry. And that data is not really factored in here. So clients that eventually move into a project and are enrolled in a project will be counted if they're in one of these other project types, but coordinated entry data is not contributing to the SPMs. So the other project types are street outreach, safe haven. The East no longer has any active safe haven projects, so there's no data there, but you'll see it listed because it is part of the specifications. Shelter, transitional housing, and then permanent housing, and that includes rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and then those with a designation of housing only and housing with services that are not PSH. Not all of the project types contribute to all of the measures. Some of them do, but some don't. And that's shown in the table that's on the slide. And then some of the measures are, we'll see very specifically, they will have these sort of like breakouts where they tell you about very specific project types or a project type. So as we go through that, you'll see what that looks like. Why do we care so much? Because the HUD scores us on system performance as part of the CoC NOFA application. And as you can see, the slide shows that it's really grown in importance over the last 6 years or so. And now the SPM's data contributes fairly significantly to the CoC's overall score. And what is HUD looking for? And a lot of these areas, they're looking to see a 5% improvement, and that's what will get you the most points. If you regress and kind of have, you don't improve at all, you're unlikely to get any points on whatever the measure is. So this was the breakout for the 2019 CoC NOFA application. We don't know what it's going to look like in this year. It's been a weird year, and HUD has acknowledged that it's been a weird year, so we'll see. But you can see that they basically ask us to report out on pretty much all of the SPM data, and so it matters. I also wanted to touch briefly on this issue of HMIS bed coverage rate because, it's going to, I'm going to raise it throughout the presentation just as a bit of a caveat in terms of our understanding of the East data, the actual performance that we're seeing when we look at the aggregated system performance measures data. And I say this because, as you can see from this chart, the HMIS bed coverage rate for ES and TH project types is a bit low. HUD's threshold is really 85% on the NOFA. We lose points when we don't reach 85%. And the other one is PSH, where it's close, but not quite there at 82%. Maybe we'll get there. But the issue here is that we're not exactly seeing all of the projects that are operating within the CoC's region. And so our understanding of the performance is impacted because we're actually not seeing everything that's out there. All right, so I'm going to jump in and go sort of measure by measure. So let's start with measure one, which is length of time persons remain homeless. And I think this is probably the one that HUD has the greatest emphasis on in terms of, say, NOFA point values and then other work. All right, so measure one is one where HUD is stitching together through the specifications. They have CoCs pull the data and stitch together a person's length of time homeless across potentially many enrollments, right? And it's not really about any one specific project length of stay. It's really the length of stay across potentially multiple projects. There are these two sort of sub measures. There's 1A and 1B. And we'll get into that in the next slide, a bit more of the difference, but essentially one is strictly bed nights, entries and exits in HMIS, and the other factors in additional data points. The data reported out is calculated for the average length of time homeless and the median, and it shows the fiscal year that you're reporting out and then the prior year so that you can see if you're sort of making progress. And HUD is looking for us to reduce the length of time homeless to keep pushing that down. Their goal is this 30-day goal, which is a wonderful idea, very hard to make a reality. In terms of what we have to report out on the NOFA application, it's 1A.2. So We'll talk a bit about the difference between 1A and 1B. So there's within each of these a 1.1 and a 1.2. On the 1A side, it's ES and SH. As I said, there aren't any safe haven projects anymore, so it's just really shelter. And then 1.2, shelter and transitional. For 1B, it's shelter and PH, and then shelter, transitional, and PH. And for 1B, because we have PH factored in, they start to pull in these additional data points. One of those is the client's response to 3.917, that's data element 3.917, the approximate date their homelessness started, which is a self-report date. And it also factors in the time between the project start and housing move-in date, which is very particular to PH projects. So it's important to know that those two data points get added in. And here's HUD's in the programming specifications, their attempt to sort of explain what does and doesn't count as a day homeless. And it's complex. The specifications are, I don't know, like several pages long of just programming specifications, because you're going back and looking at like this history of the client and have all these sort of date ranges applied and rules and conditions. So it's complicated. We could probably spend an hour or two just talking about this. We will. In terms of what gets reported out, length of time homeless, we've got the average and the median. We've got the 2 years, and then the two sort of sub measures within each. And we can see that the CoC did okay from 2018 to 2019, had this reduction. And this is the one right here, 1.2 under A, that gets reported out for the NOFA. What you can see is when you go into B, the numbers really jump up. And this is where we really start to see the impact of having this approximate date homelessness started data factored in along with the time between project start and housing move-in date. So when we talk about data issues that we could think about, where we can have sort of like what I consider low-hanging fruit, where we could have an immediate impact, I've kind of noted a bunch of stuff on this slide. One of the things I will always go back to is, again, the low HMIS bed coverage rate, which means I think we're likely seeing artificially low length of time homeless, because we're not seeing all the times that some of these folks were in shelter or transitional programs that aren't covered in our system. In terms of things that we can do, exit clients from particularly from shelter and transitional housing programs, but really from all programs, and do that promptly. Inactive projects need to be closed out. So, when folks have projects that then go inactive, they need to be coordinating with the DCD team, and then the team needs to close out those projects and make sure the clients are exited. And then when we talk about measure 1B, we have these two data points in particular, right? And I think the one that feels pretty actionable in the immediate term is to reinforce with everybody to enter a housing move-in date when a client has moved into housing. And if the client doesn't move into housing, they need to be exited. So that's the importance of that is that the clock just keeps running for the clients when they have no housing move-in date. So the system reads that client as still being homeless. And the same thing is true for folks who are in ES or TH projects that are never exited, right? The system just thinks they're still homeless, counts them still in the project, and they still accrue days homeless. So these are two things that we can really do to drive down that, and that's just on the sort of data quality side. The other thing is really think about how we are capturing the approximate date homelessness started, how that interaction goes with clients, how the question is asked, and to make sure that if the client kind of says something like, well, I've been homeless since 1990, that maybe there's more conversation there to make sure that that data isn't, that date doesn't like get entered into the system without figuring out if that actually means the client's, been, homeless really that entire time. And then in terms of the cleanup effort that we've been doing for the SPM's data cleanup, we've been doing follow-up with ES projects and TH and rapid projects where we see this sort of length of stay that's a bit longer. That to us is just maybe where we do follow up to say, like, are you sure that those clients are still in your project and you haven't just failed to exit them? Again, that's sort of one of those easy data cleanup things. I think we've had a few comments in the chat, and I think, Lauren, I'll just leave it to you to sort through those and let me know if we need to review anything.
I think the question, Christy, is if questions are coming to mind for people, do we want to pause and ask them in the moment, or do you want to wait until the end?
I mean, I think let's wait till the end, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, so if anyone has questions as they come to mind, just type them in the chat, and when we get to Q&A, this way we can go one by one, and we won't miss anything.
Great. So measure 2, moving on, is the extent to which persons who exit homelessness to permanent housing destinations return to homelessness. All right, so the key to understanding measure 2 is it's not everybody who returns. It is this subset of people who exited to a permanent destination and then returned. So it's a sort of like smaller sliver of the whole. And that's important to understand. And it's this sort of group of people who exited out from very specific project types: outreach, shelter, transitional, safe haven, which we have none of, and then permanent housing as a full bucket encompassing rapid, PSH, and then the others. And then it looks at the returns within these specific intervals of time. So what gets reported out is less than 6 months, returned within 6 to 12 months, 13 to 24 months, and then it sort of totals up everybody who returned within 2 years. And for HUD was obviously looking for this to be reduced. They don't want to see returns, right? And what the CoC is sort of, I guess, on the hook for is returns within 12 months across all project types. That's what we have to report out. So one of the odd things about measure 2, if you think about it, right, somebody returned, well, HUD has to define a sort of a date range for this. And what they say is we're going to look at the time period 2 years prior to the report period for the SPM's report. And we're going to look at folks who exited, and of those, folks who then exited to a permanent destination, and then of those, folks who then had another project start within the system in the same group of project types. So it's this look back in time, which really is important for us to understand that we need to maintain data going along, and the data we enter now will still be impacting the CoC years in the future, right? So it's important to just think about that, and then the call to continue to clean up data that might feel older to us, but is still actually getting pulled into our SPM's report. And again, we have one of these charts where they try to explain how they figure out if a return counts or doesn't count. Again, we don't have time to dig into all the details here, but it is there for those who wanted to get into this. This is what gets reported out. This is one of the few measures where we actually don't see the prior fiscal year data reported out in the report itself. We'd have to go pull that report to then see if we had made an improvement or not. The rates are pretty low. And you can see here, we have the different time periods, the 6 months, 6 to 12, 13 to 24, 2 years, and then the different project types, and then everything totaled together. I think it's artificially low. I'll say that again, this is related to the HMIS, low HMIS bed coverage rate. Obviously, we're not seeing folks who return to projects that aren't in HMIS. So that means that we do have to be aware that while the data looks low, that we have low return rates, there are likely more people out there returning that we just can't see. And then again, this idea of like, this one is grabbing data from 2 years ago, right? So we need to be aware that we need to continue to clean up old data and be very mindful of the data we are entering now, because that will continue to live with the CoC over the course of the next few years. And one of the things I think we can do on this one is really ensuring that clients are properly exited, wherever possible, that they have an exit destination, and that inactive projects are closed out and those clients are exited. And this one's one where I think to improve performance requires a little more effort, because it will be, I think, important to look to see if we see any patterns of returns across specific agencies or projects, and then have some sort of figuring out, well, why would those places have more folks returning. We kind of expect a higher rate of return, maybe from folks exiting straight from shelter, and maybe lower rates from other project types where they've had more, case management. So thinking about that and sort of letting that be a thing that we think about in the sort of like medium to longer term. In terms of data cleanup focus, again, that's really been on making sure that inactive projects are closed out and clients are exited. Measure 3, number of homeless persons. This one's pretty straightforward. It's pretty much grabbing the PIT data, but at a very high level, because the PIT data, we can slice and dice lots of ways. They keep it pretty high level for this chart, and reports out the last 2 PIT counts. And then it also does this sort of look at shelter, safe haven, and transitional folks in those project types, and reports that out as unduplicated total shelter data. And again, it shows the last 2 fiscal years. For this one, HUD obviously looking for us to continue to push down the number of people experiencing homelessness. And what we have to report out on the NOFA goes back to the PIT data, always the PIT data. Part of this is because what the PIT data has that the annual count doesn't is unsheltered, a count of unsheltered folks. So this is the data report out. And you can see it just kind of reports out by different project types, and then we have unsheltered for the PIT data and not for the annual count data. But it's pretty straightforward. And what we can do here is really to make sure that the clients are appropriately enrolled and exited, and that inactive projects, again, are closed out. You hear me say that like constantly, but it's really important because we just don't need like extra people in the system that should be exited. And then we need to make sure that we submit high quality PIT and HIC data, and that task Jessica is helping to coordinate, and she's having a great time right now doing that. But that's really important work, because the PIT and HIC data is the stuff that is reported out on the NOFA in various ways. And then in terms of the data cleanup focus, again, it's really just been on these making sure inactive projects are closed out and those clients are exited. Measure 4, employment and income growth for homeless persons in CoC program funded projects. This is everybody's favorite, especially if you're a CoC project, funded project. So this measure really is only looking at adults. They don't expect kids to have income. And only adults in those CoC funded projects, because other funders don't necessarily require this information to be captured and entered into HMIS. So they only pull it for CoC funded projects. It's broken into 2 groups, which are stayers and leavers. This is familiar for those of you who have CoC funded projects, right? You got your stayers and your leavers. And then 3 categories within that: your change in earned income, change in non-employment cash income, and change in total income. And what HUD wants to see for this one is for us to always be increasing the percent of participants who are increasing their income. Easier said than done. And for the report out of on the NOFA, very specifically, we have to report out 4 and 5, 4.4 and 4.5. That means leavers and their change in earned and non-employment income. So this one, I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but I just did want to note that people sometimes have concerns about who is captured and who's not when it comes to earned income. But for stayers, anybody who's in the project for less than a year isn't going to be captured in this data set, the report out. And then in general, what the system is looking for both stayers and leavers is that they have two data points, an earlier financial assessment and a later one. And that is different for stayers and leavers, exactly what they're looking for, but they need the 2 data points to figure out if you've increased your income. If you have a stayer without an earlier assessment, the system will actually just ignore that person. And the same for leavers. If a leaver doesn't have a project start assessment, they're going to ignore that person. However, if they have had their assessment at some earlier point or at project start, but they never got a later assessment, they're going to count the person and they're just going to count them as having no increase in income. So that's sort of the scenario we try to avoid by hounding people to do their assessments. And I think the biggest thing that folks can do is just make sure they do the assessments when they're supposed to. So once the system has figured out who should be included, it then goes in and grabs the data. I did want to clarify that only annual assessment data is pulled. It's not going to pull the during program assessments. It's not set up to do that. And very specifically, an annual has to be done in the period of 30 days before or after the anniversary date of the client for it to be included. So it's really like got to be the annual assessment. The information date has to be in that 30-day period before or after. The system will then compare the 2 data points, the 2 assessments, and figure out if your client has increased their income. So hopefully they have and they get added in, but that's not always the case. We know that. And our data shows that this is a challenge, obviously, depending upon sort of the project type. Now, when we look at stayers, we expect that a lot of these folks are stayers in permanent supportive housing. They're going to have a lower rate of increasing their income. For earned income, a higher rate of non-employment income increases. That's to be expected. And then when we look at leavers, this is much more likely to be folks who are exiting out of rapid rehousing, probably. And so we see a little bit of a different pattern, right, where they have a pretty good rate of increasing income, earned income, and then not as much on the non-employment cash income side, but still pretty good on total income. In terms of the things that we can focus on, one, we again just keep our focus on the CoC funded projects for this particular measure, and then just making sure that these assessments are done at entry, the annual, during the time period it's supposed to be done, and then at exit. We can pull DQ reports to look at this. Agencies can do this, and we as a system could do this. And assessments can be entered later, but nobody should be falsifying data. It's really the information date, that's the date at which that information was gathered and was true, that the system will read. And then in terms of data cleanup focus, what we've been focusing on is any project, CoC funded project, where we see a less than 30% increase in total income, and then we reach out, and then when we see a 0%, that's when we really reach out and say, like, are you sure? Can you go back and check and make sure that's accurate? All right, measure 5 is number of persons who become homeless for the first time. Measure 5 is one of these ones that, again, looks back in time. And again, like back in time, like 2 years, but it's not open 2-year window. The 2 years is tied to the client's last project start date. So they're going to look back to see if the client ever was in another program over the last 2 years. And it's looking at shelter, transitional, safe haven, or permanent housing. And there are two sort of measures, 5.1 and 5.2. 5.2 has the PH projects included in it, and 5.1 does not. Again, SSO not included, and street outreach not included in this. So it really is focused on folks who are enrolled in a sort of project, more typical project. And then HUD wants to see reductions in this, and we have to report out 5.2. In terms of the data, this is one where I wish the report out was a little different. They actually calculated the rate so you could see it. You can't. So you have to do the math yourself and compare 1 year to the next to see if you're making improvements. I will say this is pretty high. This is maybe what I would say is artificially high, again, due to this low HMIS bed coverage rate, because we're not seeing when people might have entered one of these other projects that are out there but don't report into HMIS, right? So we consider this one where the CoC is reporting out a number that's artificially high, perhaps. And then in terms of what we can do on the data side, the big one here is deduplication of records, and to make sure that we do not duplicate records moving forward. So just making sure that that we go back and we deduplicate records as possible, and that we are not creating a new record for somebody every time they enter the system, but instead really truly looking for them to find their existing record. If we do, they'll always be first-time homeless, right? And then again, just this issue of old data matters, right? The system is going to look back for each client, 2 years prior. So all that data really is important, and we have to think about that as we maintain our data moving forward. Measure 6 is one we don't have to worry about. Why? Because the CoC does not have any projects approved to serve Category 3. I'm not sure any CoC does. So this measure is not applicable right now. Measure 7, successful placement from street outreach and successful placement in or retention of permanent housing. What is a successful placement? It really depends on the project type. And that's important to hold on to. And I'll show you a chart in a minute, which gets into that more. But there are really 3 sub-measures within Measure 7. The first, the universe, is persons who exit to street outreach, or who exit street outreach, sorry. And then the second focuses on persons in ES, SH, TH, and PHRH who exited, plus people who were in a permanent housing project but never moved in, right? So they're included in 7B1, and then 7B2 is persons in all PH projects except Rapid who exited after moving into housing, or who moved into housing and remained in the PH project. So this is the one where they count retention. And why? Because PSH primarily has folks staying in it for quite a long period, and they consider that to be successful. So in terms of what HUD wants to see, they want to see this moving up, always increasing, and we have to report out 7B1 and 7B2. And then this is our list of exit destinations that are considered successful by project type. So you can see SO, almost everything is considered a successful exit. But for ES, TH, PH, SH, and then they say SSO, but for those, the list is much more restricted to what we, the list that shows up in your APRs, right, as your permanent destinations. And then there are some exclusions. This is what the data looked like. We see this number actually for street outreach creeping up, which is great. And then we've got much higher numbers we'll see for 7B1 and 7B2. This is, I think, fairly typical. And if we did a breakdown for the persons in ES, SH, well, not SH in this CoC, but ES would probably be much lower. We'd see a higher rate for TH and probably the highest rate for rapid. And then this is always very high across most of the CoCs we've worked with for PSH, in part because they do count retention. So in terms of making a dent in measure 7, our focus on really ensuring clients have exit destinations is important, and that they're exited in a timely manner, because the longer you wait, the less likely you are to remember or gather that information or have it in some way. And I think we can expect that projects that are working with clients on a longer term basis and providing more case management should have higher rates of exit to permanent housing destinations. So that would really be our TH and our rapid, and also our PSH, obviously, but that's those are the ones where I think we could work more to look and see if we see any projects that aren't exiting folks to permanent destinations, and then figure out what could be done to improve that. And again, we have these sort of like thresholds that we establish for our data cleanup, which is exits to PH under 80% for transitional housing and rapid, and then we follow up if it's under 85% for PSH. We just want to make sure that we're seeing accurate data. We follow up with projects on that. So some next steps. I sort of took the liberty of putting some of the things that have come out as action items. And there are some things that I put in the immediate bucket and indicated which SPM is, I guess, the highest impact, because theoretically improving the data across a bunch of these things is just good overall for the system. But what I put in the immediate bucket is really this idea of data quality review and training on entering housing move-in dates for PH project clients, exit destinations when a household exits, conducting the financial assessments for adults and CoC funded projects, and then ensuring inactive projects are closed out and clients are exited. So those are things that I thought of as like, this seems to be like low hanging fruit. We could probably, as a CoC, tackle this without too much extra effort, right? And then in terms of the immediate to medium term, going back and reminding folks that there is a timeliness standard. And I know this is not always easy. It's easier said than done. But to really be entering and exiting clients and updating their information in a timely manner is important. It's important for the system in lots of ways. And then again, this going back to measure 1, this approximate date homelessness started. Digging into that more, thinking about how the question is asked within the system, what's the sort of prompt, right? And then how that interaction goes between the person taking that data and entering it in. And there are some things that we could think about of when you come across that client again, do you get to update that information? How is that, again, how are those interactions going? But digging into that a little bit more. Medium to long term is deduplication of records. That can be a pretty big project. I think it's something that the CoC has been working on for years, and it's an ongoing project, but always, I think, reminding and making that a point in training to make sure that people don't create new records, duplicate records, and that they really are looking to find folks in HMIS who may already have a record. Identifying and engaging with projects with the highest rates of non-PH exits and rates of return. Again, this is a more, I feel like medium to long-term project. These things are to dig in a little bit to understand what is going on with those, and what some of the strategies might be to address those issues. And then obviously a big one, increase HMIS bed coverage rates. That's a big project. I know it's a big project. We at DMA have lots of thoughts and ideas for tackling that, but that is a more CoC-wide project for sure. And then if you want to get into some of the system improvement strategies that HUD has laid out, this is from one of their system improvement briefs. and where they really say like, okay, here are some things to think about in relation to the SPMs, some strategies that could be implemented. And this is a few years old. We might actually be doing many of these things already in some way. These really, I think, after you kind of do some data cleanup and really have a stronger sense of like what we're seeing in our data is really, it's a good reflection of where we're at, then you can kind of dig in a bit more on these to kind of get to some of the underlying programmatic issues that might be happening. And a lot of these things would be CoC-wide initiatives as well. So I'm going to stop there. I feel like I talked a lot. I know there were some questions going on in the chat box, and if folks want to unmute and just ask your question, or anybody want to dig into any of the topics. And we can always revisit this, obviously, at future meetings too.